My name's Helen, and I'm a clinical lead nurse for end of life care in community nursing services.
Well,
And I work really closely, obviously, with the community nursing teams and also a couple of inpatient units. And I was asked to see a patient because the community nursing teams had known this gentleman for a long time, and they were actually, very professionally fond of him and knew his family well. And what they were struggling with was that he'd become very unwell and was considered to be at the end of his life.
mhm,
And they felt that they weren't sure if he had an understanding of that. They were unclear of what conversations had happened, and they were not feeling that that was something they wanted to do because of that connection and
mhm.
just the emotional sort of part of it. And also it's a very difficult conversation to have. So I said absolutely fine. I went to meet him. His daughter was with him, and she was also really anxious about what was happening. Um, and she was also very anxious because she needed to go home and she didn't want to leave him, and she was worried about him being on his own. So we had a conversation about how she was worried that dad might not know that he was passing away, and was he scared? She was really worried about, was he scared? So we had a chat about it, and then I really recognised that what was important to her right then was that she needed to get this offload and go and get what she needed to get from home. So I said, well, why don't I stay with your dad while you go home, so then he's not alone, and then I can just have a chat to him and see how he is, see what's going on. So I found myself, feeling really quite privileged because I was sat in the bedroom next to a man who I'd never met, and realized quite quickly that I was going to be having a really sort of sensitive conversation. And this wasn't something I wasn't kind of used to, but I think the whole setup of knowing I was going to have this conversation, because sometimes you don't realize it's going to happen,
Mhm.
felt a little bit more kind of emotive, I suppose. So yeah, I found myself sat next to him. Obviously, we had a chat, and we talked about an opening sort of conversation about how I noticed that he had an ornament of a Jack Russell in his lounge. So
Mhm.
I said that I had Jack Russell dogs and all that. And then I said to him, um, what's going on with you right now then? Understand you're not so well. And at that point, I didn't realize I was going to be using clean language. This was just a normal way that I would communicate with my patients. But I could straight away then, I suddenly thought, I think this is where I might be able to, use this. So he said, well, he said, I'm going to be going over the wall soon. And I said, what kind of wall? And he said, well, I'm going over it. It's a wall that you go over. And he sort of did that with his hand.
Mhm.
And he said, because I'm going to be passing on. And he said, and I just need to get over that wall. And I said, tell me more about the wall. And he said, it's lovely the other side. He said, um, I know that that's where I'm going. I just need to get over it. So I said, what else about the wall? And he said, well, over the other side, there's people waiting for me. And I said, tell me more about that. So he said it was his mum and his dad. And he made a comment on how, even though he was in his sort of 80s, how he actually still, had wanted to see his mum and dad again. And he said, and all my Jack Russells, they're all over there waiting for me. So by now, the way he was describing it, I could feel a bit of a lump coming in my
Mhm.
throat because I sort of felt like he was really picturing that. And then by asking him those questions, I could feel that I was sort of understanding what it was that he was thinking. And then I said, and is the wall, is it a happy place? And he said, oh yeah, the sun's shining. And he looked at me and he said, and I'm not scared. And I'm not scared, even though I didn't have to ask him that. And I said, and what else about the other side of the wall? I said, what else is there? Who else is there? And he said, um, my ex-wife, she's also there. So I asked him more about that. Um, and this conversation did go on for the whole hour.
Yeah.
Just shortening it. But I used those questions to really sort of drill down what it was he was trying to say. And when he started to talk then about the wall being his death, I said, and what would you like to have happen? And he said, I would like to know that my daughters are going to look after each other. So we talked about how when his daughter came back, that he would also share what he'd shared with me with his daughter, because obviously I was aware that she wanted to know, was he okay? So we then sort of chatted about other things, and his daughter came back, and so I said, would you like to share, with your daughter what we've discussed? And so between us, we kind of relayed it to her. And the really powerful part of that was when he said that over the wall was his ex-wife, because his daughter sort of broke into tears and said, I always knew that you still loved my mum. And that then created this kind of, moment between them. I think for her, knowing that sort of closure, if you like, that even though they'd separated, it was her mum and it was her dad, but actually he then opened up and said that he, was going to see her over the wall. And I think the other part of it was by asking the questions. The daughter had explained to me that he was a very closed book normally. He didn't normally open up. So again, I think for them it was quite a powerful situation in which she heard more from him, or things she'd never heard from him. Yes, so I found myself, excusing myself and saying I had a cold, where I having to blow my nose. Moments with him, I was quite touched by it. Like I said, I think it was the whole situation of being with this man and having that conversation and being really privileged to be a part of that.
So I'm obviously touched by the story. I can see why everybody said you must get this story recorded. And I'm curious, you're obviously not unused to having this kind of conversation. What difference do you think the clean language questions made?
I think for me, even though it was only in that moment that I decided I was going to use them, it created a structure for me to feel like I could be calmer in asking them. So it felt like I had a bit of sort of control over what I was going to ask and not stumble over my words. Although it was the first time I'd used them with a patient, I felt a bit of sort of confidence in them. Yeah.
So the feeling of confidence is in you when you
Yeah.
had the structure of the questions.
Yes. Yeah.
And and how long have you been doing the kind of work you do?
Well, I've been a nurse, a qualified nurse now for 25 years. And or is it 26 years? I qualified in 98. And throughout my career, I've had lots of involvement with patients that are dying. So I've worked in a variety of settings, sort of a long time as a very newly qualified nurse for 9 years on an acute medical ward. And then I was ward manager more recently of an elderly person ward. But this role I've been doing for just under a year.
And would you recommend these clean language questions to other people doing similar roles?
100%. And to the point that to celebrate, or not celebrate, to acknowledge Dying Matters Week, I've made contact with colleagues who were going to actually work together and do a couple of webinars on clean language and how that can be used, not only with patients, but I've really recognised the value of those questions with colleagues, and family and beyond, but certainly in a work situation, how this will help other people to have that sort of feeling of control when they're having difficult conversations, whether it's the therapist or the nurses or doctors who I work with, whoever it is.
And how did you come across clean language?
I honestly can't remember, but I was on I think it was from a webinar I was on, and then I looked that person up, and then I realized that they did something about clean language. I thought, what's clean language? And then I looked into it, and then I joined the Q community, and then I made contact with you, and I immediately felt this was exactly the kind of thing that worked for me, because I'm a coach as well. And I've really seen those similarities, if you like, with the coaching kind of questions that I use. And I can
Mm.
see how I would also use these in coaching. So immediately it just felt like, oh, this is so, so good, and how I really feel like it will help my colleagues. So I've started to sow seeds around already and talk to people about it, and used that example that I've given you today to sort of show how that evolved from using those questions.